I'm your host, Hillary Ricken, and this is the Cannabis Law Now podcast, where we regularly discuss issues related to the cannabis industry, including investment, day-to-day operational issues, and potential reform on the horizon that will impact all cannabis businesses and investors in the United States. And on today's episode of the Cannabis Law Now podcast, I'm so happy to have with me Husch Jain, who is the founder of Ananda Strategy. Husch, how you doing?
I'm doing great. So great to be here, Hillary. Thanks.
Good. I'm glad to have you. Now, if you haven't heard of Ananda Strategy and Husch, you may have been living under a rock, because Husch is one of these guys that I think really has the pulse nationally of what's happening in the cannabis industry, and not just in the United States, but probably even globally. We're very lucky to have him today. What are you up to these days with Ananda?
We're lucky enough to be working on a lot of exciting projects, on behalf of plant-touching operators, on behalf of ancillary businesses, even on behalf of nonprofits. And, I'll give you a few examples of those. We're lucky to represent many of the leading retail chains in California. And so we've helped these businesses open, what we believe will be some of the most successful stores in the state. And so those are stores like Airfield's new store in Redwood City, a project I was lucky enough to work with you on. Airfield has long been one of the most successful dispensaries in the state, and we think their new store will be no exception. Wheelhouse, we helped them open their store in Ventura. That was the official dispensary of Hall of Flowers that just happened last week. So really proud of that. The Artistry is about to open a store in Laguna Woods, and we helped them entitle that store. So that's something that we're really passionate about, helping establish really strong retail businesses to help the legal market get an upper hand. Also happy to work with a bunch of great brands. Just to give you one example, one of our clients is Mammoth Distribution, which has heavy hitters and Almora and, just added Papa and Barkley. And so helping them think about who to go deeper with in California and how to move into new states. And, just a few more examples that I'll give because I think it reflects how interested at least I am in every part of the space. I'm on the board of SC Labs, and I know testing labs are less sexy to some people, but it's really important that they function properly in order for the legal market to have integrity. And obviously I'm biased, but I think SC Labs more than any other operator leads with integrity. And, that's why they're the official testing partner of the Emerald Cup and of the California State Fair. So really proud of that work. Also help investors, get a sense of what the state and federal and even global landscape is. And I'm sure we'll talk about that to some extent on the show. And, finally, I'll just note, really proud to do a lot of pro bono nonprofit advocacy work. So I'm on the board of CalNormal. And in recent years, we've done things like pass an employment rights bill, help pass Scott Wiener's bill that requires medical cannabis patients to have access to cannabis delivery. And so, those are just some examples. And maybe the final thing I'll say is, I think the common thread here is understanding the legal and regulatory landscape across the country and across the world. That's something I'm really fascinated by, seeing these state experiments take shape. And, I'll just mention, prior to working in cannabis, I worked at Airbnb for many years, building out their policy team and helping legalize, short-term rentals around the world. And I bring that up because it was that experience of understanding how policy manifests itself in different geographies on an issue that I, am very passionate about, travel. It's kind of the same thing that animates me here in cannabis.
Yeah, I have no doubt. And it's funny that the two would kind of make interesting bedfellows with all the localized issues and issues around diverse laws, multi-state patchwork quilt of regulation that Airbnb has faced domestically and internationally, and so is cannabis. And I was lucky enough to get to know you through that Airfield competitive licensing process in Northern California. And I was super impressed with your level of work and dedication and understanding of the local politics. And really the reason why we have you on today is because of an exciting development actually in my home state, which is the state of Florida. I was born and raised there. I'm a Miami Hurricane. That's where I went to law school. And the first question I want to ask you, because obviously you're active there, you're helping stakeholders there. What's the current status of cannabis in the Sunshine State? I think people are confused about whether it's a low THC, pro CBD market, a true medical cannabis market, and some of that might be by Florida's design, which can typically take an opaque shape. I have litigated there administratively, believe it or not, years ago over some of the initial licensing that was issued, and it was complex and it was fast and furious, unlike California or any of the Western states that I've been in. So what's the current status there?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Hillary, I would say that Florida is a robust medical cannabis market, the most robust medical cannabis market in the country. And so just a little bit of history here. In 2016, Florida passed a medical cannabis ballot initiative. So that was in November 2016. And that initiative passed by 72% of the vote, which is the most votes that any ballot measure in Florida history has ever gotten, going back 150 years. So I think it's notable that way back in 2016, 8 years ago, Florida overwhelmingly passed this medical cannabis ballot measure. That measure sort of implicated a very restrictive limited license framework. So I think that's the other thing to know about Florida is that it's medical, but it's also very limited license. And not only is vertical integration required, it's what I would call a strict vertical integration requirement in that there is no wholesale market. Everything that I sell in my stores in Florida, I myself have to produce. And so Florida initially issued 22 licenses. And so there's been a lot of commentary about how, that's a very limited license market, right? Given the size of the state of Florida. And so, there have been charges that the sort of model there is, a little bit oligopolistic. And so that's sort of the framework in Florida. Sales started in mid 2017. But I think it's important to note that sales didn't really start taking off in Florida until 2019, early 2019. And that's when, Ron DeSantis, in one of his first acts of governor, allowed flower into the medical cannabis program in Florida. So in short, they had a program since 2017. In 2019, the program really started to accelerate once flower was added to the medical program, which is something we've seen in many states. And, we can talk more in a second about how the market has performed. But in short, over the past 4 years, there's been really steady growth, in Florida. There's almost 900,000 medical cannabis patients registered in Florida, which is more than 4% of the population getting on 5%. And so I think it's safe to say it's a very robust medical market as measured by patient count or also as measured by sales, which we can get into.
That is wild. And I do recall, and I haven't looked at the Florida statutes in a long time, but going back to 2016, there was or is a requirement, at least, that these had to be generational farmers in Florida, I think, because the litigation that I handled on the administrative side with the Department of Health was a battle by an existing farmer in Orlando who I think didn't secure licensing for his particular region because there were only so many of them, as you mentioned. Is that still the case today? I know there's been litigation over that subsequently.
Yes, so that is still the case for the initial licenses that were issued. I think two other things to note is the state later issued a couple of licenses called Pigford licenses, which relate to, historical discrimination that farmers in Florida have suffered as a result of the Department of Agriculture. So those 22 licenses became 24. And I think the other thing to note is that Florida recently had a licensing process and will be issuing a couple dozen more licenses this summer. And so that's an effort to steadily diversify the market and to move away from that requirement of being generational farmers. And so, yes, there's been an effort to diversify that landscape. But I'll just say some of these operators that have had a presence in the state are so far ahead that these other licensees are going to have a really difficult time catching up in terms of locations, in terms of capital. And so that's how things are going moving forward.
I believe that. And I'm licensed to practice in Florida. And I remember when that legislation took shape, having come from Western cannabis markets that were totally entrenched since the mid to late 90s, people thought, are there even farmers out there that have been in existence for that long? And in Florida, the answer is absolutely yes. It's a big ag state with a focus on citrus. So I don't think it was tough to find these generational farming families and businesses that were interested that already had this infrastructure. And to your point, they're probably leaps and bounds ahead of any future licensees. So how has the medical market performed? And when I say performed, I mean, by comparison with other medical markets, you and I both know this, at least in the West Coast, medical seemed to be a stepping stone into adult use, and then medical kind of receded depending on really access and geography, local control in the state. How has it gone down in Florida?
Yeah, I would say the performance of the medical market in Florida has been very strong. I mentioned the patient count before. If you have between 4 to 5% of residents in the state registered as a patient, that reflects that the program is healthy. So that's one way to measure it. I think another way to measure it is sales. So Florida routinely generates about $200 million in sales each month. That makes it about a $2.5 billion market. And so that makes Florida, the third biggest market in the country, behind California and behind Michigan, which are both adult use states. So it's pretty remarkable that obviously Florida is a big state, but it's a medical only market. And it's the third biggest market in the country. And I think the reasons for that are actually quite simple. One, you have really robust access to cannabis. There are more than 600 dispensaries in Florida. And so even though Florida is a big state, if you look at the map of dispensaries in Florida, there is pretty robust coverage. And that, stands in stark contrast to a place like California that still has huge swaths of the state that lack cannabis access. So part of it is like, hey, it's really accessible to buy cannabis legally, even though you need a card. I think the second reason the market has performed well is low taxes. Florida does not have a medical cannabis tax, which is remarkable. I mean, it has the regular 6% sales tax that these medical cannabis purchases are subject to, but it's not subject to an additional tax. And so Florida stands out when it comes to other markets. And thirdly, Florida just in general has cheap pricing. It is often the case that you can go into a medical cannabis dispensary in Florida and for less than $20 out the door, you can get an eighth, even if it's a lower quality one. So I'd say the Florida medical market has performed very well for those kind of obvious reasons: access, kind of pricing, and taxation. And, perhaps just the other thing to note is just by virtue of its license structure, those gains have accrued to a very small number of operators. So, there's 4 operators that account for half of those 600 dispensaries in the state. Those are, names that are probably familiar to people: Trulieve, Air, Verano, and Cureleaf, some of the largest cannabis companies out there. So if there's any criticism to be leveraged of the program, it's that the program is doing well, but that there are 4 companies that, account for half of the dispensaries and likely more than half the sales in the state.
Yeah, the price point is fascinating. Again, we're both coming from the West Coast where it's heavily saturated and it's a race to the bottom. Those caps on the number of operators that are allowed, despite the number of dispensaries that have proliferated, because there's only so many of them, I imagine that that's helped prop up that lower price structure. And kind of an unfair question. If you don't know, you don't know. Does Florida allow sun-grown cannabis at these existing farms, or is it mostly indoor?
I've never heard of sun-grown cannabis in Florida. I believe it's mostly indoor. I'm not sure whether they allow it or not, but even if they do, I don't think it's very prominent in the state.
Understood. Yeah, I was just thinking about some of those huge fields and kind of plantation style growing that's used for citrus with Quonset huts. If they would just put their cannabis crops alongside their orchids or their oranges, whatever they're growing, probably not. I'm no farmer. So what is also happening with adult use? That seems to be a huge initiative in Florida after many, many years of trying and failing to get an initiative on the ballot. It's happened, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think this is really exciting. I think this could be the most exciting event of 2024, maybe along with rescheduling. To talk through the mechanics here, right now, the Florida Supreme Court is still reviewing the constitutionality of the ballot measure that has gotten enough signatures. And this is worth bringing up because in the previous 2 election cycles, the Florida Supreme Court has deemed the initiatives unconstitutional for reasons that we can kind of get into. And so that's the big thing that we're all watching right now. And the Florida Supreme Court has an April 1st deadline to decide whether this initiative is constitutional or not. So that's coming up really soon. The other thing to note is that the Florida Supreme Court tends to release its decisions on Thursday mornings. So as you and I are talking here today, it's Monday, March 18th. There are 2 Thursdays left in March. There's Thursday the 21st and Thursday the 28th. And technically they could do nothing and the clock could run out and then it would be automatically approved. But I believe they'll weigh in on this measure one way or another. And so although I don't know, I'm just going to take a shot in the dark. And I think maybe on Thursday, the 21st, the Supreme Court will render their decision. And this decision essentially touches on something called the single subject rule. Florida says hey, you can put something on the ballot, but it can only touch on a single subject. And previous initiatives have been invalidated because they allegedly touched on multiple subjects. And so this initiative has been drawn in a very narrow way to avoid that issue. And so just as an example, if there were an initiative that were to say, hey, we want to legalize cannabis and legalize home grow, that would be deemed invalid because it touches on multiple subjects, which is why this has been drawn very, very narrowly. And so, we could talk about this issue for a while. So I'll just kind of summarize it quickly. The Supreme Court's going to weigh in. I believe this initiative has been drawn in a very narrow way to allow it to pass that requirement by the Supreme Court. And those people who watch the oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court will say even the conservative justices on the court were skeptical of the state's claim that this was unconstitutional. I'll also just note that there's been a lot of parsing of Governor DeSantis's comments in recent months. Some people have seized on a comment by him saying that he thinks that it'll make the ballot as him signaling to the justices he appointed that they should approve it. Other people have seized on comments where he says he doesn't like the smell of cannabis as suggesting he's anti-cannabis. I think there's a lot of back and forth there. So we'll just kind of have to see how things unfold. But I'll say that I am very optimistic it'll appear on the ballot. And the other thing to note is that if it appears on the ballot, it requires a 60% vote in November in order to pass. It's the only state in the country that requires a 60% threshold rather than a simple majority. And so even though there's strong support in Florida and polls show, say, like a 65% or higher approval rating, that's one obstacle to sort of get past. And then the final things I'll note is that if it were to pass, there's a strict 6-month implementation period. So the election is on November 5th. So if this were to pass, sales by law would have to start by Cinco de Mayo, 2025. So that could be fun. And in that intervening period, the state legislature has some ability to tweak the initiative. And I mention that because, there may be an effort to restrict potency or impose product restrictions or impose labeling restrictions. And so that's the other thing we always have to watch for after an initiative is passed.
Yeah, right. There will almost certainly be some form of rulemaking. Don't know the level of aggression, but I'm with you on the likelihood of it making the ballot. My understanding is that it's essentially a carbon copy of the medical initiative, just with essentially recreational installed, which leads me to my next question. If 60% of Floridians vote in favor of the initiative, assuming it makes the ballot, because by the time this episode airs, we will know those questions, what happens in the wake of legalization in Florida? And that's a really, really broad question. So I'll try to narrow it down to a few things. Does the alleged oligopoly just explode because the initiative is written in such a way that those existing operators essentially get first dibs? Is there some kind of collateral impact federally? I mean, what do you see happening there? Because I too agree. And having been born and raised there, understanding the politics, it's a unique place for better or worse. This is an incredibly heavy lift for Florida. So what do you see happening if they vote in favor?
If Florida votes in favor, I think this will be the crown jewel of U.S. cannabis. And people are excited about this, but I'm going to tell you why I'm even more excited than the average person is about Florida. Again, I think it'll be a very robust market. I think it has the potential to transform cannabis politics in the Deep South as a region. I think it has the potential to change the way that Republican politicians approach the cannabis issue. I think it even has the potential to tip the U.S. nationally towards legalization when you consider Florida's population. But to stick on the first thing, right? What kind of a market will this be? I think it'll be a very robust market. And look, Florida has a huge population, 22 million people. And we've had other big states come online before, notably California and New York. But those states have lacked the infrastructure to immediately facilitate robust adult use sales. New York had a very limited medical program, unlike Florida. And California made the catastrophic mistake of deeming 80% of its existing medical supply chain illegal. And so I guess that's a way of saying we've been excited about big states coming online before, but this is a big state that actually has robust medical access. Again, I encourage anyone to look at a map of the 600 dispensaries in Florida, and you'll see that kind of like on day one, there'll be robust access across the state. The only real analogy I can draw is to Missouri. And obviously Missouri is, 25% of the population of Florida, but Missouri was one of those states that had a robust medical program spread across the state that turned on sales on day one and immediately saw a step function in terms of growth. And so I think Florida has the potential to be a very robust market because of that robust retail access. There's 22 million people in Florida. Florida also sees 130 million tourists, which is just remarkable. There's remarkable tourism into Florida. And again, just to really double click here, I'm going to kind of get into the weeds. But when people come to Florida, it's a different type of tourism. They're not coming to Florida for business tourism necessarily, unless they're going to the Benzinga, cannabis conference. They're going for...
We know who they're going to see. They're going to go see Mickey Mouse.
Right. Exactly. Right. They're going there for recreation, right? Or they're going to the Florida Keys. And so people go to, or for spring break. And so not only do they see a ton of tourists, but they'll see a ton of leisure type tourists. I'll also note there's plenty of international tourism. And I bring this up because this really has the potential to change attitudes towards cannabis in other countries. I remember being in, just as a quick side note, being in New York during UN week last year. And so many of the foreign dignitaries were kind of offended by what they saw as the sloppy nature of legalization in New York and pointed out the hypocrisy of the US leading the war on drugs and then allowing an illicit economy to develop in New York City. I think Florida has the potential to be just the opposite, to be a well-regulated system that, makes people look at cannabis positively. So again, 22 million people, 130 million tourists, the international tourists, and, the fact that there's robust retail access. Pricing is low. We've already discussed how Florida does not have a medical cannabis tax. Now, they will probably impose some kind of an adult use tax, but I think this presents an opportunity for the very conservative legislature and the governor in Florida, after they hopefully come around to the fact that this is passed, that they can distinguish themselves from the disasters in California and New York by taking a different tack on cannabis. And so that's sort of why I'm so excited. And then I'll just also note, Florida borders a number of states in the Deep South. And, we can talk about the impact on the Deep South in a second, but, people forget Florida's not just Miami, right? It borders, Georgia and Alabama and is close to Mississippi and is even close to New Orleans. And so we can talk about it more in a sec, but I think it'll have a transformative impact on the region.
Yeah, knowing Florida, it would die to distinguish itself from New York and California in multiple different ways. But also similar to California, it is the size and population of several states. I'm with you that there's a domino effect here in multiple different ways and that Florida has an opportunity. And I say this every time a big market is examining this. There's the opportunity to invoke the gold standard for this particular democratic experiment. I'm very confident that does not yet exist. It seems as though when states are turning on or turning over from medical, instead of taking the best policies from each other, they're actually carbon copying the worst in an effort to satisfy what I couldn't even tell you anymore because the Department of Justice is so hands off. So I sincerely hope that Florida gets it right if they do go there. But let's talk about the rest of the Southeast, because this is kind of this locked up Great Wall of unknown where if Florida goes, do you think it has enough chutzpah to capture the rest, to influence the rest to fall in line?
I do. And, I would also put it this way. If Florida were not to move, those states will be stuck in the status quo for years, right? We have to remember, how have we gotten adult use measures in this country? We've gotten it via ballot measures or through unified democratic control. We've never had a GOP sort of state leadership kind of produce an adult use measure. Right. And so those states are kind of stuck in the status quo until Florida can change things. Now, why do I think Florida will change things? Again, there's South Florida, but we kind of forget about the Florida panhandle, right? So if we look at the northern part of Florida, there are major metro areas in Florida that are right on the Georgia border, right? If I think about Jacksonville and Tallahassee, for example, those are just 30 minutes away from the Georgia border. And I go back to the example of Missouri. The reason that Kansas City, Missouri is probably the most productive cannabis ecosystem in the United States right now is it lies right on the Kansas border. And so there's immense opportunity for these major metro areas that lie on a border to draw in traffic from neighboring Georgia. So I think that's exciting. There's also Alabama. Again, if you just look at a map, Montgomery, Alabama is just a 2-hour drive, down to Florida, right? And so you will see people driving into Florida to access cannabis. If you really think about, Pensacola, that western part of Florida, which borders like Gulfport, Mississippi, right? And parts of Alabama, that's really quite close. And, New Orleans, for example, is only a 2.5-hour drive from Florida. And even like Charleston, South Carolina is only a 3.5-hour drive into Florida. And I mentioned this, I know that kind of sounds like a long drive. The reason I think this is important is if we look at a state like New Mexico, for example, there are people driving 4, 5, 6 hours across West Texas, which is very rural, in order to access cannabis legally in New Mexico. And so I think you will see the entire Deep South start to move into Florida and into a part of Florida that is culturally indistinguishable from the Deep South. The Florida Panhandle is the most kind of conservative region of the country. So I think it has the potential to transform the Deep South and really to accelerate some organic change that is already happening in the Deep South. And by this, I mean, the fact that Mississippi is quietly adopting, one of the fastest growing medical programs in the country's history and has more than 150 dispensaries, right? Or that Georgia and Alabama are finally getting their programs off the ground. And so I think it'll just illustrate how nonsensical prohibition is, and it'll impact the Deep South in that way.
And what do you think some of the future potential pitfalls are for businesses, even these existing operators? Because once you flip into adult use, it's a whole different set of public safety and policy concerns. You mentioned even setting different THC levels for adult use products. It's just a completely different ballgame with adult use. People think they can borrow from medical. They really cannot if it's regulated, for example, like alcohol. If you're going to treat it like a pharmaceutical as adult use, pretty much defeats the purpose. So most states treat it like alcohol or tobacco. And since you're coming from California, which I think is just the host of horribles in what could have been an amazing opportunity, do you see more local control coming into play? Do you see additional competitive licensing coming into play, even for existing operators that want to expand? Higher taxes, social equity. We have litigation in Florida on the medical program to right the wrongs of past discrimination across farmers. Do you see it coming back in the form of social equity to promote social justice here? What do you think some of the trappings are, the downsides for these businesses if we get adult use in Florida?
I think there are a few potential pitfalls. I think one of them is sort of potency caps, which we can get back to in a second. But I think many of the pitfalls that we've experienced here, say in California, will not be repeated in Florida. I mean, let's go to local control, right? The state legislature may, for example, give cities the ability to ban a lot of adult use cannabis businesses. But, the way the initiative is written, these existing medical cannabis businesses will be able to convert to adult use by May 5th, right? And so this issue of access that has proven to be a problem in New York and California simply won't be a problem because there'll be robust infrastructure. So I think that's one critical thing. When it comes to licensing, as I mentioned, there is an ongoing licensing process right now. And sometime this summer, Florida will issue, a couple dozen more licenses. But I don't really anticipate that kind of holding up the process as it is done in New York because of the robust medical infrastructure that exists. And, you mentioned social equity. My expectation is that there'll be some minimal effort to sort of address criminal justice issues, say related to expungement, the kinds of issues that couldn't make their way into the initiative because of the single subject rule. And so I think Florida may approach equity in a way similar to the way that Ohio plans to, or Missouri, which is to say, there'll be some effort to maybe diversify the marketplace. But I think Florida is such a conservative place that you will not see a full-fledged equity program in the way that you would California or New York. That's on that issue. When it comes to taxes, I think Florida has an instinct for low taxes. There's no state income tax. They have no medical cannabis tax. So again, I think it's an opportunity for DeSantis and the GOP to distinguish themselves from California and New York. So yeah, that's why I don't think those things will be issues. I think the one thing that could potentially be an issue, again, are issues of potency or product restrictions or advertising and labeling. As I mentioned, there has been a bill introduced that was not yet successful to limit the potency of products. And there has been a history in Florida of the state legislature trying to intervene on the heels of a successful ballot initiative. I mean, just to give you one example, in 2018, when Florida passed a voting rights, felon voting rights restoration initiative that basically said, hey, if you were formerly a felon, you should still be able to vote. The legislature turned around and said, okay, that initiative passed, but you have to pay all these fees in order to expunge your record and obtain your voting rights. And so there's always ways that a hostile state legislature can, in theory, respect, the amendment that passed, but try to introduce friction into the process. And so I think that'll be the really critical thing for advocates. And the last thing I'll say is that's why I think the vote count is so important, right? In the same way that Ohio passed with 57% of the vote, and the folks in Ohio can't mess with that initiative because they realize they would be running into a political buzzsaw. That's why we need a really strong vote in Florida, not 60%, but better. And I'm actually pretty optimistic about that.
And just on the regulatory side, because it's a big part of my practice, when the regulators come into play, this is when the politics really show up, especially things like lobbying and private interest groups. I imagine that those existing licensees have a firmly secured place at the table. Do you think in Florida that Department of Health, Department of Ag do a good job of listening to those stakeholders? Let's put voters aside because that's one form of political pressure with direct democracy in action. Do you think they listen to their licensees? Because I've been in states where your pleas, your advocacy positions, your policy suggestions, how you're running your day-to-day business, it just falls on deaf ears completely when it comes to government relations.
Yeah, what I would say is this. I would say the regulators in Florida, it may not be that they listen more, but they're just less eager to get involved in the business of their licensees is what I would say, right? So they have adopted more of a hands-off stance. And so they may not be actively listening for feedback, but they have just been less eager to intervene in the program. And they only kind of intervene when there's some political pressure to do so. I mean, just to give you an example, when Green Thumb Industries announced this innovative program to put cannabis in gas stations, that was one of the few things that made the regulators stand up and say, hey, we haven't kind of signed off on that. Or when DeSantis says, hey, these operators are making so much money, we should charge them higher fees. That tends to be the reaction. So largely, I've seen them be a more silent regulator, which, I mean, compared to other states, I don't think is always a bad thing.
Yeah, same here. Sometimes it's not bad to have a reactive regulator because you can always ask for forgiveness depending on the level of conduct. I wish other states would experiment with that sometimes and how they oversee their licensees. Now, Florida already has shown an aptitude and an appetite for intensely regulating the products that go on the market, not necessarily any kind of creative way, more like this is our prohibited products list, thou shall not pass. I'm currently writing a blog post on it for my law firm's own blog, the Delta 8 ban, right? And existing medical ecosphere. Have you been following that? And Do you know how the market's reacting to that? Is this a preview potentially of what we could get if adult use goes in November?
Yeah, I mean, so the bill you're referencing is Senate Bill 1698, I believe it is, and the bill is passed and it awaits DeSantis' signature. And if he signs it, it'll take effect October 1st, so right before the adult use initiative. And this bill essentially, bans Delta 8 and Delta 10 and imposes like a 5 milligram serving limit on sort of products with Delta 9 in them. And so it renders a lot of existing hemp products in Florida illegal. And so what I would say is this. The fact that these products have proliferated so much across Florida illustrates the latent demand there is for cannabis amongst citizens that exist out there. So I would say that's point number one. Point number two is, Florida has passed this legislation, but as we've seen in many states, oftentimes this legislation is challenged in court. And so there's many states that are passing bans and later federal courts are weighing in on whether that is consistent kind of with the Farm Bill. And so I think that's kind of anyone's guess how that all kind of plays out. And in light of that uncertainty, I guess I would say that's why the adult use measure is so important, right? In states where there's robust cannabis access that is affordable, that is accessible, we tend to see, the least amount of these hemp intoxicant products. And look, I recognize that there's a complicated debate going on about these products and how, they can help certain folks that don't have access to cannabis. That's a complicated debate we probably don't have time to get to on this episode. But I would just say, look, folks, have a demand for cannabis. There are some reasonable concerns about the safety of these hemp intoxicant products. And so the best way to usher people into products that are safe and tested is to ensure that cannabis is legal for adults and is accessible. And again, I would point you to markets like Michigan or, the Canadian market where these hemp intoxicant products are not popular because people can easily access affordable cannabis. And so that's why, again, I think this initiative is so important. But maybe the only other thing I'll say is, this issue has to be managed delicately, right? Obviously, there are a ton of people that operate in the hemp space in Florida who are upset about this bill, who view the multi-state operators with suspicion. We've seen in other states that adult use measures can fail when there's divisions within the cannabis community. So I think it's really important that these MSOs who are, looking at this juicy pie in Florida over the next few years don't get ahead of themselves and find ways to build an inclusive cannabis community, because otherwise we won't be able to get over the finish line. And look, the state legislature is never going to bail us out in Florida. So we need the people to be behind us to move this forward.
Man, Husch, if the feds ever get their act together, I would nominate you for top weed czar, because you're right down the middle. And that's exactly what we need in this political ecosystem on this particular topic. So just a last couple of questions for you before I let you go. And this can be your plug for voters and consumers. What do they need to know about Amendment 3, the potential ballot initiative, assuming it gets past the Supreme Court in Florida? We're both hopeful about that. What do they need to know about it at this point?
I think what they need to know is if you are in Florida and listening to this, right, and you have the chance to vote for this and you care about cannabis, not only passing this initiative, but passing it by a healthy margin, I think would be a seismic event in the history of cannabis reform. And so what I mean by that is I believe the record is New Jersey, that with 67% of the vote voted to legalize cannabis. I, based on polling, am cautiously optimistic that we can get up to that number. If we get to a number like 67%, again, that'll eliminate the ability of anyone in the state legislature to really mess with the initiative. That'll send a message across the entire Deep South that the reddest of states where woke allegedly goes to die, right, is kind of okay with cannabis. I think it'll change the calculus of Republican politicians across the country who will have seen Ohio, which is the bellwether red state, and then Florida, which is the contemporary, reddest of red cultural politics states, vote for cannabis. Even someone like Ron DeSantis, who, won with a landslide, right, in 2022 with 60% of the vote. I mean, if Florida gets 67% of the vote, that's going to make him look poor by comparison. Or again, someone like Rick Scott, the senator from Florida, he won his last re-election with 50.05% of the vote. If cannabis gets 67, it's going to be harder for him to continue to be an obstructionist. So I think Florida has the ability to send a message to the Deep South, has the ability to send a message to, folks in the GOP. And perhaps most importantly, if Florida were go adult use, then 60% of the people who live in this country would live in an adult use state. And that doesn't even count some of the other, states that might go adult use like Hawaii or New Hampshire or South Dakota. So, if Florida goes adult use, I almost want to say, I don't care who the next president is, right? You're going to have to pay attention to cannabis because it'll be overwhelming even in the most conservative states. And so that's why it's so important that everybody in Florida votes, obviously, in favor of the initiative.
And give me your prediction now, because again, this will air after we get the decision from the Supreme Court, but obviously before November, do you think it's going to pass?
Yes. I think it'll clear Supreme Court review. And then I think it's going to pass with 66% of the vote in November. So that's my prediction.
All right, we got your predictions. Okay, Husch, thanks for coming on. It's been a real pleasure. You are so knowledgeable and charismatic, and your clients are very lucky to have you. And we are very fortunate to gain your insights on what could be a seismic shift in cannabis policy that's kind of been a sleeper. Not many people are watching Florida in this capacity. They know about it a little bit, but I don't think they know what the impact is that it could actually have. So thanks very much for your time. We appreciate it.
This was so awesome. Let's get it done.
And that concludes today's episode of the Cannabis Law Now podcast. Until next time, stay alert, stay alive.